The arrow struck before the sun had fully risen, and the sound that followed was not a roar but a groan, low and human in its pain, echoing across the ravine like something that should not have been able to break at all. Elira Hart froze at the edge of the tree line, her basket of herbs still hanging from her arm, her breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. She had come out before dawn only to gather fever bark from the eastern slope, the way she did every third morning, careful to stay far from the paths the hunters used. She had not expected to find the thing the entire village had feared for 3 generations, lying broken in the dirt below her. The dragon was enormous, larger than the old stories had ever managed to describe, his scales a deep green that shifted to black in the shadow of the rocks. One wing was pinned beneath him at an angle that made her stomach turn, and a hunter's barbed arrow, the kind tipped with the poison the men brewed from crushed nightroot, was buried deep in the muscle beneath his shoulder. Dark blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the pale stone. She should have run. Every lesson of her childhood told her to run, to find the nearest bell tower and ring the warning, to let the men of the village finish what their arrow had started. The dragon had killed people, or so the stories said. He had burned the old grain houses. He had taken lives that the village still mourned every autumn during the remembrance fires. But Elira had spent her whole life healing things that could not ask for help. Wounded foxes, birds with broken wings, a wolf pup once, caught in a trap, snapping and snarling until it finally understood she meant no harm. She was the village healer's daughter, though the village had stopped trusting her gift the day she saved a rabid dog instead of letting it die, the day they started calling her strange, behind cupped hands and closed doors. The dragon's eye opened. It was gold, threaded through with red from the pain, and it fixed on her with a clarity that startled her more than the size of him ever could. "Go," the voice said, and it was a voice, deep and cracked and unmistakably a word rather than a growl. "Before they find you here with me." Elira's basket slipped from her arm. Herbs scattered across the stone. She had never heard the old stories claim the dragon could speak. Perhaps no one had ever gotten close enough and lived long enough to hear it. "You're going to die if that poison reaches your heart," she said, surprising herself with how steady her own voice sounded. Nightroot moves fast once it's in deep tissue. The dragon's lip curled back over teeth the length of her forearm. "Better that than what your people would do to me if they found me helpless. I'm not going to tell them. Why would I believe that?" She didn't have a clean answer for him, not one that would satisfy a creature who had every reason in the world to expect nothing but cruelty from her kind. So instead of answering, she knelt down at the edge of the blood pool, keeping her hands where he could see them, and began gathering the herbs that had fallen from her basket. "Fever bark slows poison," she said, half to herself, half to him. "It won't cure it, but it will buy time. I have a needle root tincture at home that might do more, if I can get back before midday. Why would a healer from a village that hates me lift a single finger to save the thing they fear most?" Elira looked up at him properly then, past the size and the teeth and the smoke that still curled faintly from his nostrils with every labored breath. Underneath all of it, he looked frightened, not of her, of what was happening inside his own body, of a pain he could not fight his way out of an ending he had clearly never expected to face this way, alone in a ravine with an arrow in his shoulder. "Because you're hurt," she said simply. "That's the only reason I've ever needed." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her the way a wounded animal studies anyone who comes too close, searching for the trick, the trap, the second arrow waiting behind the first. Whatever he found in her face seemed to loosen something in his shoulders, just slightly, though it clearly cost him. "There is a poison-fighting root, the dragons of the old mountains once used," he said. "Silvervein. It grows only near still water, in shadow, where the stone stays wet. If it still grows anywhere in these hills, it grows near the pool below the ridge." "I know the pool," Elira said. She had fished there as a child, before her mother died and the village decided a girl who spoke too gently to wounded creatures was better left to herself. I can be there and back before the sun clears the far peak. And if the hunters see you, then I'll tell them I was gathering herbs. Which will be true. She stood, brushing the dirt from her knees, and something in the dragon's gold eyes shifted. Not quite trust, not yet, but something close enough to it that it made her chest ache in a way she didn't have time to examine. "What is your name?" he asked as she turned to go. "Elira. I am Kalith." He said it like it had been a long time since anyone had asked, like the word itself was heavier than it should have been. The last time a human spoke my name instead of simply cursing it, I do not remember when. Elira did not answer that. She was already moving, quick and light over the loose stone, following the narrow deer path down toward the pool, while the morning mist still clung low enough to hide her from the ridge above, where she knew the hunters sometimes walked their early rounds. Her heart hammered with something that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but sat somewhere dangerously close to both. The pool was exactly as she remembered it, dark and still beneath an overhang of gray stone, ferns crowding the damp edges where the light barely reached. She searched methodically, the way her mother had taught her before the fever took her, checking under leaves, along the waterline, in the crevices where moisture pooled longest. It took longer than she wanted. The sun climbed steadily higher, and twice she heard voices carrying faintly on the wind, men's voices, rough with the particular energy of a hunting party that believed it was close to its prize. She found the silver vein root at last, a cluster of pale, thread-like tendrils growing from a crack in the stone just above the waterline, exactly where Kalith had described. She dug it free with careful fingers, wrapped it in a leaf, and tucked it deep into her basket beneath the fever bark, where it would not be noticed if anyone stopped her on the path. The climb back up was harder than the climb down, her legs burning, her breath tight in her chest, and twice she had to duck behind rock formations as the hunting party's voices grew closer, then faded again as they moved along a different ridge. She did not know these men by name, but she recognized the tone in their voices. The low, hungry excitement of people who believed they had finally found what they had been chasing for years. By the time she reached the ravine again, sweat-soaked and shaking with the effort of moving quickly and quietly at once, Kalith's breathing had grown shallow and uneven. His great chest rose and fell in short bursts, and the skin around the arrow wound had darkened to a color that made her stomach twist, with real fear for the first time. "You came back," he rasped, and there was something like disbelief threaded through the words. "Of course I came back." She dropped to her knees beside him, already crushing the silver vein root between two flat stones, mixing it with water from her flask into a thick, pale paste. "Hold still. This is going to hurt more before it helps. I do not think I have the strength left to fight you even if I wanted to." "Good. That makes this easier." She worked quickly, packing the paste directly into the wound around the base of the arrow, careful not to jostle the shaft itself, murmuring instructions to herself, the way she always did when her hands needed to move faster than her fear could catch up to them. Kalith's whole body went rigid at the first touch, a low sound rumbling deep in his chest that was not quite a growl and not quite a groan, but something caught painfully between the two. "I need to pull the arrow free," she said. "It's the only way the paste can reach deep enough to stop the poison from spreading further. It's going to be worse than anything that's happened so far." "Then do it." She braced one hand against his shoulder, feeling the impossible heat of him even through his pain, the way his scales seemed to hum faintly beneath her palm, like something alive in a way she had never touched before. With her other hand, she gripped the arrow shaft as close to the skin as she dared and pulled, one swift, clean motion, exactly the way her mother had taught her to remove anything embedded too deep to work around. Kalith's roar shook loose stones from the ravine walls. Elira nearly lost her footing from the force of the sound alone, but she kept her hands steady, packing more of the paste into the open wound the moment the arrow was free, pressing a folded cloth hard against it to slow the fresh bleeding. "It's out," she said, breathless. "The worst of it is over. Now we wait and see if the silver vein does what the old stories claim it does." For a long while, neither of them spoke. Calith's breathing remained ragged, but slowly, gradually, it began to even out, the tremors running through his enormous body growing less violent, less frequent, until at last he simply lay still, watching her with those gold eyes as she checked the wound again and again, unwilling to trust the change until she had confirmed it 3 separate times. "The color is better," she finally said, more to herself than to him. "The dark has stopped spreading. I think it's working. You saved my life. I did what anyone with the knowledge should have done." "No," Calith said, and something in his voice made her look up sharply. "No one else would have done this. Your people have hunted my kind for generations. They tell stories of my cruelty to their children before those children can even walk. And yet you knelt beside me in the dirt and pulled poison from my blood with your bare hands." Illyra did not have a response for that, not one that felt adequate to the moment, so instead she simply reached for her flask and offered him water, tipping it carefully toward the corner of his enormous mouth, and he drank from her hands like something far gentler than any story had ever painted him. The sun had climbed well past midday by the time she judged him stable enough to leave, though leaving him at all felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite name. She promised to return the following morning with more silver vein paste and fresh bandaging cloth, and he watched her go with an expression she would spend the rest of the day trying to understand, somewhere between gratitude and something far more fragile. She did not tell anyone in the village what she had found in the ravine. Not her closest friend Wren, who noticed the mud on her boots and the strange lightness in her step, and asked twice if something had happened. Not old Cedric, who ran the trading post and always seemed to know when she was hiding something. She kept the secret pressed close against her chest the entire walk home, through the narrow lanes between the cottages, past the well where the women gathered each evening to trade gossip, all the way to her own small house at the edge of the village, where she finally allowed herself to sit down and shake. She had healed the dragon everyone feared, and somewhere in the space between his first ragged breath and his last grateful glance, something in her own chest had shifted too, quietly, irreversibly, in a direction she did not yet have the words to describe. That night, she lay awake long after the candles burned low, staring at the ceiling and listening to the distant howl of wind moving through the mountain passes, and she found herself wondering, with a nervousness that felt entirely unfamiliar, whether Calith was lying awake in his ravine as well, thinking of her the same way she could not stop thinking of him. In the morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, she filled her basket with fresh bandages and a new batch of silver vein paste, and she walked back toward the ravine, telling herself it was only because a patient needed tending, knowing even as she thought it, that the reason ran far deeper than that, and that whatever had started in that ravine the day before was only just beginning. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Illyra had never expected her life to hold. Before dawn, while the village still slept behind shuttered windows, she slipped out with her basket full of bandages and paste, climbed the narrow deer path through the mist, and spent an hour, sometimes 2, tending the wound on Calith's shoulder while the sky slowly turned from gray to gold above the ravine. By the 4th day, the swelling around the wound had gone down enough that he could shift his weight without wincing. By the 6th, he could lift the injured wing a few careful inches, testing the muscle beneath with visible relief spreading across features she was slowly learning to read, despite how little a dragon's face seemed to resemble a human one at first glance. "You're healing faster than I expected," she told him, pressing a fresh cloth against the wound and tying it off with practiced hands. "Another week, maybe less, and you should be strong enough to fly again." "And then what?" Calith asked. His voice had lost the raw, cracked edge it carried that first morning, settling instead into something low and rich that she found herself listening for even when he wasn't speaking. "I returned to my mountain, and you returned to a village that would burn you at the well if they knew what you'd done. They won't know." Illyra. He said her name carefully, the way he said most things, as if each word were being weighed before it was allowed to leave him. Your friend already suspects something. I can smell the worry on you when you arrive some mornings, the way you glance behind yourself on the path. She hadn't told him about Ren's questions, the increasingly pointed comments about mud on her boots, and the strange new lightness in her step. And yet somehow he had noticed anyway, in whatever way dragons notice things that humans tried to hide. Ren isn't a threat, Illyra said. She's my friend. She wouldn't tell the hunters even if she guessed. Everyone is a threat until proven otherwise. That is a lesson my kind learned a long time ago, and learned it in blood. Something in the way he said it made her set down her cloth and look at him properly, the way she had been doing more and more often over the past days, studying the deep gold of his eyes, the intricate pattern of scales along his jaw, searching for whatever story lived behind the careful walls he kept raised even now, even with her. "What happened to your kind?" she asked. "The stories in the village only ever talk about what you did to us. They never mention what came before." Kalith was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer at all, the way he had every time she'd asked some version of this question over the past several days. "There were more of us once," he finally said. "A whole line of us, living in the high caves above the Ashvale Range, keeping to ourselves, taking only what we needed from the wild herds and leaving the villages untouched. My mother used to say that peace between our kinds was possible, that it had existed once, long before either of us could remember. What changed? A hunting party came into our territory nearly 20 years ago, chasing something else, a wolf pack that had been raiding their livestock. They found our nesting grounds instead. My younger sister was still an egg at the time. They didn't know what they were looking at. They only knew they had found dragons, and dragons meant glory, and gold, and stories to tell for the rest of their lives." Illyra felt something cold settle low in her stomach, already guessing where this story was going and dreading the confirmation of it. "My mother fought to protect the nest," Kalith continued, his voice dropping lower, rougher, like the words themselves cost him something physical to release. "She killed 3 of the hunters before the rest retreated. But my sister's egg was destroyed in the fighting, and my mother never recovered from either loss. She died the following winter, and I was the only one left. Kalith, I'm so sorry." The village remembers the 3 hunters my mother killed defending her nest. They tell that story to their children as proof of a monster's cruelty. They do not tell the story of the egg that never hatched, or the mother who died grieving it. They only remember the parts that let them keep hating us without question. Illyra sat back on her heels, the weight of his story settling over her like something physical, and she understood then, with a clarity that made her chest ache, exactly why the village's fear ran so deep, and exactly how wrong the shape of that fear had always been. "I attacked the grain houses 3 years ago," Kalith said, before she could speak. "That part of the story is true. I will not pretend otherwise. I was alone, and angry, and grieving in a way I did not know how to carry, and I made choices I have regretted every day since. I hurt people who had done nothing to me directly, and I cannot undo that, no matter how much I wish I could. But you stopped. I stopped because destroying things I did not understand did not bring my mother or my sister back. It only made me exactly the monster your people already believed me to be." He turned his great head to look at her fully, gold eyes steady despite the rawness still threaded through his voice. "I have spent 3 years alone in these mountains since then, keeping my distance from every village within 100 miles, trying to prove to myself, if no one else, that I was capable of something better than what I became that year." Illyra reached out, slowly, and rested her hand against the scales near his jaw, the way she might comfort any wounded creature grieving something it could not put into simple words. He went very still beneath her touch, as if unused to gentleness offered without hesitation, without fear trembling somewhere beneath it. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I have never told anyone that story. Not fully. Not like this. Why me? Because you are the first person in 3 years who looked at me and saw something other than the ending of that story. You saw the beginning too, the part where I was simply someone's son and someone's brother, before the world decided I could only ever be a monster. The walk home that morning felt different than any of the 6 that had come before it. Alira found herself replaying his words the entire way, turning them over like stones in her pocket. And by the time she reached the village, she had nearly forgotten to check whether anyone had followed her, a carelessness that would prove far more costly than she realized in the moment. Ren was waiting near the well when she arrived, arms crossed, expression carefully neutral in a way that immediately put Alira on guard. "You've been going up the eastern ridge every morning for a week," Ren said, without preamble. "I know because I followed you partway yesterday before I lost your trail near the old deer path." Alira's stomach dropped. "Ren, I can explain." "Then explain. Because Garrick Thorne has been telling anyone who'll listen that fresh dragon tracks were spotted near the ravine 3 days ago, and half the hunting parties in the village are planning to search that whole stretch of mountain by week's end." The name settled over Alira like a shadow crossing the sun. Garrick Thorne had lost his younger brother to the dragon attacks 3 years ago, the same attacks Kalith had just confessed to her with such raw and unguarded shame. Garrick had spent every season since leading hunting parties deeper and deeper into the mountains, driven by a grief that had long since curdled into something closer to obsession. And he was, by every account Alira had ever heard, both relentless and dangerously skilled with a bow. "You have to trust me," Alira said carefully, choosing each word the way she imagined Kalith chose his. "Whatever you think you know, it isn't the whole truth." "Then tell me the whole truth." Alira hesitated only a moment before deciding that Ren, of everyone in the village, deserved honesty more than protection born of fear. She told her everything, quietly, standing close together near the well where no one else could overhear, from the arrow in the ravine, to the silver vein paste, to the story Kalith had shared only that morning about the mother who died grieving an egg that never hatched. By the time she finished, Ren's face had shifted from suspicion to something far more complicated, caught somewhere between disbelief and a reluctant, dawning sympathy. "You've been healing him," Ren said slowly. "The dragon everyone in this village has feared since before we were born. He isn't what the stories say he is, not anymore. Maybe he never fully was. Alira, if Garrick finds out what you've been doing, he won't just be angry. He'll see it as a betrayal of everyone his brother's death still means to this village. You could be exiled, or worse. I know the risk." "Do you? Because it sounds like you're more worried about a wounded dragon than about what happens to you if this comes out." Alira didn't have a clean answer for that either, not one she was fully ready to admit even to herself, though somewhere deep beneath the fear of exposure, a quieter truth had already begun to take root, one she wasn't yet brave enough to name aloud. "Will you tell anyone?" she asked instead. Ren was quiet for a long moment, glancing toward the well, toward the lane where 2 older women stood trading morning gossip within easy earshot, before she finally shook her head. "No, but you need to be more careful than you have been. Garrick isn't a fool, and neither are the men who hunt with him. If they find fresh tracks leading toward that ravine, it won't matter how careful you think you're being." That evening, Alira lay awake long past the hour she usually managed to fall asleep, turning Ren's warning over alongside the story Kalith had shared that morning, trying to find some path forward that didn't end in either exposure or heartbreak. She thought of Garrick Thorne's grief, real and justified in its own right, colliding against Kalith's grief, equally real, equally justified, 2 wounds that had never once been given the chance to see each other as anything other than enemy and monster. She thought, too, about the way Kalith's voice had softened when he spoke her name, the careful gentleness in a creature the entire village had spent generations believing, incapable of anything but cruelty, and she understood, with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified her, that whatever this had become between them, it had already grown far too large to simply walk away from. The next morning, she left for the ravine earlier than usual, moving with more caution than she'd shown all week, checking behind herself twice on the path and choosing a longer, more hidden route through the trees. She did not yet know that Garrick's hunting party had already begun searching the lower slopes at first light, moving methodically upward, following the same fresh tracks that had first drawn their suspicion 3 days before, closing the distance between the village's fear and the fragile secret peace. Illyra had spent a week building one careful morning at a time. The hunting party reached the lower ridge just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, 6 men moving in a loose formation across the loose stone, bows strung and ready, following a trail of broken branches and scorched earth that led steadily upward toward the ravine. Garrick Thorne walked at the front, his face set in the same hard, focused expression he wore every time the hunt drew close enough to taste, an expression that had not softened once in the 3 years since his brother's death. Illyra heard them before she saw them, the crunch of boots on loose scree carrying farther than any of the men seemed to realize, and her heart lurched painfully against her ribs. She was still a quarter-mile from the ravine, her basket heavy with fresh bandages, and the voices were coming from below and slightly to her left, close enough that a single wrong turn could put her directly in their path. She ducked behind a cluster of boulders, pressing herself flat against the cold stone, and tried to slow her breathing enough to think clearly. If she continued toward the ravine now, she risked leading them directly to Caelith. If she turned back, she risked leaving him with no warning at all, vulnerable and unaware, while 6 armed men closed in on his position. There was no safe choice. There was only the choice that put her in the least danger while giving him the most. She waited until the voices had drifted slightly further along the lower path, then broke from cover and ran, cutting sharply upward along a steeper, more difficult route she knew from childhood, one that would let her reach the ravine well ahead of the hunting party, even if it left her breathless and scraped by the time she arrived. Caelith was resting when she burst into the clearing, and he lifted his head sharply at the sound of her ragged breathing, gold eyes immediately alert to the fear written plainly across her face. "Hunters," she gasped. "Garrick's party. They're on the lower ridge, maybe 20 minutes behind me if they keep their current pace." Caelith rose immediately, testing his weight on legs that had grown steadily stronger over the past week, wincing only slightly as he shifted the healing wing. "I can fly. Not far, not fast, but I can put distance between myself and this ravine before they arrive. Then go, now, before they get close enough to see you. Come with me." The request startled her, though perhaps it shouldn't have, given everything that had passed between them over the last week. "I can't. If I disappear the same day the hunters find fresh tracks, Ren won't be the only one who puts the pieces together. Illyra, if they catch you here." "They won't. I'll head back down the way I came and act as though I've simply been out gathering herbs, which is nothing but the truth." "Go, Caelith, please." He hesitated only a moment longer, torn between the instinct to protect her and the urgency of the danger closing in from below, before finally spreading his wings and launching himself skyward with a powerful downdraft that scattered loose stone and dust across the clearing. Illyra watched him climb, watched the healing wing hold steady despite the strain, and did not allow herself to breathe easily until he had cleared the ridgeline and disappeared into the low morning clouds gathering over the higher peaks. She had perhaps 10 minutes before the hunting party arrived. She used them wisely, scattering loose stone over the worst of the blood-darkened patches on the ground, gathering the last of her bandaging cloth back into her basket, and positioning herself near a cluster of fever bark bushes at the edge of the clearing, exactly where a healer gathering herbs might reasonably be found. Garrick Thorne emerged from the tree line first, bow drawn, eyes sweeping the clearing with sharp, practiced suspicion before landing on Illyra crouched among the bushes. Illyra Hart. He lowered the bow slightly, though his eyes remained narrow, calculating. "What are you doing out here alone?" "Gathering fever bark," she said, holding up a handful as proof, grateful her hands had stopped shaking just moments before. The fever's been going around the eastern cottages. I wanted a fresh supply before it spreads further. This far up the ridge, there's fever bark closer to the village. Not the good kind. Not this time of year. Garrick studied her a moment longer, and Alira forced herself to hold his gaze, to keep her expression as unremarkable as the lie she'd offered, while behind him, the other 5 men spread out across the clearing, examining the ground with the kind of careful attention that made her stomach twist. "There are tracks here," one of the men called, kneeling near the spot where Kalith had lain for the better part of a week. "Big ones. Fresh, too, by the look of them." Garrick crossed to examine the tracks himself, his expression darkening further as he took in the scorched patches of earth and the deep gouges in the stone where claws had dug in against the pain of a healing wound. "This is where it's been hiding." "Was," one of the men corrected, glancing skyward. "Looks like it's already moved on." "These tracks are cold." Alira held her breath, watching Garrick's face for any sign that he suspected more than a coincidental proximity. But his attention remained fixed on the tracks and the scorched earth, the hunter's instinct working through the evidence in front of him, rather than the healer standing quietly at the clearing's edge. "It was wounded," Garrick said slowly, crouching to examine a dark stain on the stone that Alira had not managed to fully scatter. "Look at this. That's old blood, more than a few days old. Something wounded it badly enough to bleed like this for a while." "Maybe it finally died somewhere," one of the other men suggested. "Crawled off to some cave to rot." "Or maybe it's healing," Garrick said, and something in his voice made Alira's pulse spike with fresh alarm. "Which means it's still out there, and still dangerous, and we need to find it before it's strong enough to hurt someone else the way it hurt my brother." He straightened, sweeping his gaze across the clearing one final time before it settled again on Alira. Longer this time, more considering. "You didn't see anything unusual up here? No signs of the beast itself?" "Nothing," Alira said, and the lie came smoother this time, steadier, though her heart continued to pound against her ribs. "Just tracks, same as you found. I was as startled to see them as anyone would be. You should head back to the village. It isn't safe up here, not with that thing wounded and unpredictable." "Of course. Thank you for the warning." She gathered her basket and made her way carefully out of the clearing, forcing herself to walk at an ordinary pace, despite every instinct urging her to run. And it was not until she had put a full quarter-mile between herself and the hunting party that she finally allowed her hands to shake again, allowed the full weight of how close that had come to catch up with her all at once. She did not return to the ravine that evening, judging it too dangerous with the hunting party's suspicions so freshly stirred, and instead spent the night pacing her small house, worrying about where Kalith had gone, whether the wing had held steady through a longer flight than he'd attempted since the injury, whether he had found somewhere safe to rest. It was 2 days before she dared return to the ravine, and when she did, Kalith was already there waiting, having circled back cautiously once he judged enough time had passed for the hunting party to abandon the search. He looked thinner, more tired than she'd seen him since the earliest days of his recovery, but his eyes brightened with visible relief the moment she stepped into the clearing. "You're safe," he said, and the words carried a weight of worry she hadn't expected, given that she was the one who'd sent him fleeing while remaining behind herself. "I should be asking you that. How far did you fly?" "Far enough. There's a cave system 2 ridges over that I remember from years ago, before any of this happened. I sheltered there until I judged it safe to return. Garrick suspects you're still alive, still healing somewhere nearby. He's not going to stop searching." "I know." Kalith settled onto the stone with a heaviness that seemed to carry more than physical exhaustion. "And I know that every day I remain in these mountains, the danger to you grows alongside the danger to me. Perhaps it would be wiser for both of us if I flew further away. Somewhere beyond the range these hunters are willing to search." The thought of him leaving struck Alira with a force that surprised her, a hollow ache blooming somewhere beneath her ribs that had nothing to do with the danger they'd both just survived, and everything to do with the quiet, unexpected fear of never seeing him again. "Don't," she said. before she could think better of it. Not yet. Your wing still isn't fully healed, and even if it were, you shouldn't have to run from a home that's rightfully yours because a village refuses to see past its own grief. Alira, I have already caused you enough danger. You haven't caused it. Garrick's grief caused it, and a village that never bothered to ask whether there might be more to your story than the worst thing you ever did. I won't pretend that isn't dangerous, but I'm not willing to simply let you disappear because of it either. Kaleth studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his gold eyes that she was beginning to recognize as a particular kind of wonder, the look of someone still adjusting to the strange, unfamiliar experience of being chosen rather than hunted. Why does it matter to you so much? He asked quietly. What happens to me? Alira sat down on the stone beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his scales, and considered the question with more honesty than she'd allowed herself over the past week of careful, deliberate distance. Because somewhere over the last 10 days, she said slowly, you stopped being the dragon everyone in my village fears, and started being someone I care about. I don't fully understand how it happened, or how quickly, but I know it's true, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise, just because it would be safer. The silence that followed felt different than any silence that had passed between them before, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name aloud, though the way Kaleth's breathing had gone carefully still, the way his gold eyes held hers without wavering, told her he felt the shift as clearly as she did. I care about you too, he finally said, the words rough and unpracticed, as if he'd rarely had reason to say anything like them before. More than I know how to explain, given how little time has passed, given everything that stands between your world and mine. Then we'll figure it out together. One careful morning at a time, the way we've been doing all along. It was, she would later realize, the moment everything between them shifted from something fragile and undefined into something neither of them could easily walk away from, no matter how much danger the village's growing suspicion promised to bring in the days that followed. The discovery, when it finally came, arrived through the one path Alira had never thought to guard against. Peggy Millhouse, who kept the village's small dairy and who had, unbeknownst to Alira, taken to walking her goats along the lower ridge each morning for the fresh grazing the season offered. Peggy had seen Alira slip into the tree line 3 mornings running, always at the same hour, always carrying the same basket, and had mentioned it, entirely without malice, to her sister over the washing line, who had mentioned it to her husband, who happened to hunt alongside Garrick Thorne. By the time the story reached Garrick himself, it had grown considerably beyond its original shape, twisted through each retelling into something far more damning than Peggy had ever intended. The village healer's daughter was meeting someone in secret on the eastern ridge, someone she clearly did not want anyone to know about, in the very same stretch of mountain where the wounded dragon's tracks had been found. Garrick did not need much more than that to draw his own conclusions. He arrived at Alira's door on a gray, overcast morning, flanked by 2 of the men from his hunting party, his expression carrying none of the careful neutrality he'd shown her in the clearing days before. Word of his arrival spread quickly, the way it always did in a village small enough that every raised voice carried from one end of the lane to the other. And by the time Alira opened her door, a small crowd had already begun to gather at a cautious distance. I want the truth, Garrick said, without any greeting at all. You've been meeting the dragon, healing it, protecting it from the very people it's terrorized for years. Alira felt the ground shift beneath her feet. The careful secret she'd guarded for nearly 2 weeks suddenly laid bare in front of half the village, and she understood, with a clarity that left no room for further lies, that the moment for pretending had finally, irrevocably passed. Yes, she said, and the word landed across the gathered crowd like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of shock and murmured disbelief spreading outward in every direction. I found him wounded, poisoned by one of your arrows, and I healed him. I would do it again. He's a monster, Alira. He killed my brother. He burned 3 families out of their homes. He was grieving, Alira said, her voice rising to carry over the growing murmur of the crowd. His mother and sister were killed by hunters who wandered into territory that was never yours to claim in the first place. He made terrible choices in his grief, choices he has spent the last 3 years regretting every single day, alone in these mountains, hurting no one. And you believe that? A monster's excuses whispered to you in secret while he heals from wounds he deserved. I believe what I've seen with my own eyes for 2 weeks. A creature capable of gentleness, of gratitude, of genuine remorse for what he's done. Something none of you have ever bothered to look for because it's easier to hate a story than to understand the pain that shaped it. The crowd's murmur had grown into something louder now, sharper, edged with the particular anger of people who felt their grief was being dismissed rather than honored. Old Cedric pushed his way to the front of the gathering, his weathered face creased with worry rather than anger, and placed a steadying hand on Alira's shoulder. "Girl, think about what you're saying," he murmured, low enough that only she and Garrick could hear. "You're standing in front of half the village, defending the very thing that's haunted their nightmares for years. This isn't going to end well for you, no matter how true your words might be." "I know," Alira said quietly, "but I won't stand here and let them believe a lie. Not when I know the truth. Not when I've seen it myself." Garrick's expression had darkened further, something dangerously close to betrayal flickering behind his eyes, and Alira understood that whatever fragile respect might once have existed between them had shattered completely in the last few minutes. "My brother is dead," he said, his voice cracking on the words despite the anger threading through them. "He was 17 years old. He never hurt anyone, never held a weapon against that creature, and it burned him alive in our own grain house without a second thought. You're asking me to forgive that because the beast felt sad afterward?" The rawness in his voice struck something deep in Alira, a grief every bit as real and justified as her own growing feelings for Caleth. And for a moment, she found herself without any words adequate to the weight of what he'd lost. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," she said finally, gently. "I understand that what he did can never be undone, and that your grief has every right to exist exactly as it is. But punishing him further, hunting him down for a wound that's already 3 years healed over on the outside, even if it never healed at all on the inside, won't bring your brother back. It will only add more grief to a mountain that already has more than enough." For a moment, something almost like doubt flickered across Garrick's face, a crack in the hardened certainty he'd carried for 3 years, but it closed again just as quickly, replaced by a harder resolve. "I don't care what excuses you've made for it in your own head," he said. "That creature is dangerous, and you've been protecting it behind this entire village's back. The council needs to hear about this. Today." The village council met that same afternoon in the old meeting hall, a gathering Alira had attended perhaps a handful of times in her entire life, always as a quiet observer rather than the subject of the discussion itself. This time, she stood at the front of the room while the 5 council elders, along with what felt like half the village, crowded into every available space along the walls, listened to Garrick lay out his accusations in careful, damning detail. She did not deny any of it. There seemed little point, and something in her refused to shrink from the truth of what she'd done, even as she watched faces she'd known her entire life shift from confusion to disbelief to outright anger as the story unfolded. "You endangered this entire village," Elder Fairweather said finally, his voice heavy with a disappointment that cut deeper than anger might have. "You knew where a dangerous creature was hiding, wounded and vulnerable, and instead of alerting the hunters who could have ended the threat once and for all, you nursed it back to full strength. He was never a threat to anyone during those 2 weeks," Alira said. "He was healing, recovering from a wound your own hunters gave him. I made a choice to show compassion to something in pain, and I don't regret that choice, even knowing everything that's come from it since. And if he attacks again? If your compassion costs another family the way it cost Garrick's? Then that will be a tragedy," Alira said, holding the elder's gaze steadily, despite the fear tightening in her chest. "But punishing an entire creature's future for choices he made 3 years ago, in grief, after losing everything he loved, is not justice. It's cruelty, wearing justice's clothes. The murmur that followed her words carried less anger than she expected, threaded instead with an uncomfortable uncertainty, as though some small portion of the gathered crowd recognized truth in what she'd said, even as they struggled against the years of fear that had shaped their understanding of the dragon long before Alira ever offered them another version of the story. But it was not enough. Elder Fairweather conferred quietly with the other council members for several long minutes, and when he finally turned back to address the room, his expression carried the particular weight of a decision he clearly found no pleasure in delivering. Elira Hart, you have knowingly harbored and aided a creature responsible for the deaths of village members, in direct opposition to the safety and wishes of this entire community. For this, the council has no choice but to formally exile you from the village, effective immediately. You will be given until sunset to gather what belongings you require and leave these lands. The words landed with a finality that seemed to steal the air from the room entirely. Elira had known, on some level, that this was possible from the moment she'd chosen to defend Calith in front of the gathered crowd, but hearing it spoken aloud, formal and irreversible, struck her with a force she hadn't fully braced herself for. Ren pushed forward through the crowd, her face pale with shock and fear. You can't do this. She's the only healer this village has left since her mother passed. Who's going to tend the sick, deliver the babies, treat the fevers that come through every winter? That is no longer Elira's concern, Elder Fairweather said, not unkindly, though the firmness in his voice left no room for argument. The decision has been made. She has until sunset. Elira walked home through streets that felt suddenly foreign, lined with faces she'd known her entire life now watching her with a mixture of pity and lingering suspicion, none of them quite willing to meet her eyes directly, none of them quite willing to speak in her defense either, whatever private doubts her words might have stirred in them. Ren followed her the entire way, helping her gather what few belongings mattered enough to carry, her hands shaking with an anger she seemed to be directing at the entire village rather than at Elira herself. This is wrong, Ren said, folding a spare cloak into Elira's traveling bag with more force than the task required. You saved a life. You showed mercy. And they're punishing you for it as though you'd committed some terrible crime. They're afraid, Elira said quietly, gathering her small collection of healing supplies, the same tools she'd used to save Calith's life 2 weeks before. Fear makes people do things they might not otherwise choose. I understand that, even if it doesn't make this any easier to accept. Where will you go? Elira paused at the question, though she already knew, with a certainty that surprised her given how frightening the answer should have felt, exactly where her feet intended to carry her once the village gates closed behind her for the final time. To the mountains, she said. To Calith. Ren's expression softened, worry and understanding mingling together in equal measure. You care for him. Truly care for him, not just as a patient. I do, more than I fully understand myself, if I'm honest. Then I hope, whatever comes next, that he's worth everything this village has just cost you. As the sun began its slow descent toward the western peaks that evening, Elira walked through the village gates for what she suspected would be the last time, her small collection of belongings slung over one shoulder, her chest aching with a grief she hadn't expected to feel this sharply for a place that had never fully accepted her, even before today's exile. Behind her, the village she'd called home her entire life grew smaller with every step, and ahead of her, the mountains rose dark and uncertain against the deepening sky, holding within them both the greatest danger and the only true comfort she had left in the world. She did not look back. The climb into the higher mountains took the better part of 2 days, longer than Elira had anticipated when she'd set out from the village gates, with little more than a bag of supplies and a direction she trusted more than any map. The paths grew steeper and less forgiving with every mile, the air thinner and colder, and by the time she finally reached the ridge where she'd last seen Calith, disappear into the clouds weeks before, her legs ached with an exhaustion that went bone deep. She found him at dusk on the second day, perched on a wide outcropping that overlooked a hidden valley she'd never known existed, tucked between two peaks that from the village had always simply appeared as a single unbroken range. He spotted her before she'd fully cleared the tree line, and the sound he made at the sight of her, low and startled and unmistakably relieved, carried across the valley like something between a question and a prayer. "Elira?" He was on his feet in an instant, closing the distance between them faster than she'd ever seen him move, even in full health. "What happened? Why are you here, alone, this far from the village, with the sun nearly set?" "They exiled me," she said, and saying it aloud for the first time since it happened made the reality of it settle over her all at once, heavier than she'd allowed herself to feel during the long, numb walk out of the village gates. "Garrick brought his accusations to the council. I didn't deny any of it. I couldn't, not when it was all true." Calith went very still, gold eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Because of me. Because of a choice I made freely, and would make again without hesitation." She set her bag down on the stone, suddenly aware of just how tired she was, how far she'd traveled on legs that had barely stopped shaking since the moment she left. "I don't regret it, Calith, not for a single moment, but I don't have anywhere else to go, and I was hoping, if it isn't too much to ask, that I might be able to stay here. At least until I figure out what comes next." For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and Elira felt a flicker of fear that perhaps she'd misjudged everything, that the invitation she'd assumed existed between them had only ever been her own hopeful imagination, layered over gratitude and careful friendship. But then he lowered his great head, gently, until it rested close beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his scales, even in the cooling evening air. "You gave up everything for me," he said quietly. "Your home. You're standing among your own people. The life you knew, however imperfect it might have been." He paused, something raw and unguarded moving behind his eyes. "You will always have a place here, Elira, for as long as you want it. This valley is yours as much as it has ever been mine." The relief that washed through her was almost dizzying, and for the first time since the council's verdict had been read aloud in that crowded meeting hall, she felt something like the ground steadying itself beneath her feet again. The valley itself, she discovered over the following days, was more beautiful than she could have imagined from the village below, a wide green basin fed by a clear mountain stream, ringed by cliffs that caught the morning light in a way that turned the whole space gold for the first hour after sunrise. Calith's home was a cave system carved deep into the northern cliff face, far larger and more elaborate than she'd expected, with chambers that had clearly been shaped over generations by dragons who understood exactly how to make stone comfortable. He showed her a smaller chamber near the entrance, warmed by a natural vent of hot air rising from somewhere deep beneath the mountain, and told her, with a careful formality that made her smile despite everything, that it was hers for as long as she needed it. "It isn't much," he admitted, watching her survey the space with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I've had little reason to make a home comfortable for anyone but myself these past 3 years." "It's perfect," Elira said, and meant it, though the words carried a weight beyond the simple comfort of the chamber itself, an acknowledgement of everything it represented. A home offered freely by someone the world had insisted for years was incapable of offering anything but destruction. The days that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm, different from the careful, secretive mornings of the ravine, but no less precious for the change. Elira spent her mornings gathering herbs from the valley's rich soil, cataloging plants she'd never encountered near the village, while Calith, his wing now fully healed, took to the sky each afternoon, stretching muscles that had spent too many weeks confined to the ground. In the evenings, they talked, long conversations that stretched from dusk well into the deep hours of night, covering everything from the histories of their two very different worlds to smaller, gentler things, The particular way morning mist moved differently over mountain water than it did over village wells. The strange comfort of silence shared between two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words. "I keep waiting to feel afraid of you," Illyra admitted one evening, curled beside the warm chamber wall, while Kalith rested nearby, his great form curled protectively around the entrance to her small space. "Everyone always told me dragons were the most dangerous thing in these mountains, and yet I've never once felt safer than I do here, with you." "Perhaps that is because danger and safety were never truly about size or strength," Kalith said. "Perhaps they were always about intention, and I have no intention toward you but care, Illyra. I don't know when that became true, or exactly how quickly, but it has settled into something I no longer question." She found herself unable to look away from him in that moment, the firelight from the chamber's small hearth catching the gold of his eyes in a way that made her chest ache with something far too large for the small space they occupied together. "I feel the same," she said quietly. "About you." Neither of them said anything more that night, but something had shifted between them, settled into a certainty that neither felt any need to rush or force into words before it was ready, content instead to let it grow at whatever pace felt honest to the strange, unlikely bond they'd built together. It was nearly 2 weeks into her new life in the valley when the first sign of trouble arrived, carried on the wind in the form of distant hoofbeats echoing up from the lower passes, far more organized and numerous than any hunting party the village had ever assembled. Kalith went rigid at the sound, his head lifting sharply, nostrils flaring as he tested the air for scent. "That isn't Garrick's men," he said, voice low with a wariness Illyra hadn't heard from him since the earliest days of his recovery. "There are far too many horses for a village hunting party, and the formation moves with a discipline your village's men have never shown. Who else would come this deep into the mountains?" Kalith's expression darkened further, some old memory clearly surfacing behind his gold eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of dread that made Illyra's stomach tighten with fresh fear. "There is a guild," he said slowly, "far to the south, that has hunted dragons for gold and glory for generations, long before your village ever laid its first foundation stone. They call themselves the Vale Order, led by a man named Baron Corwin Vale, and they do not hunt out of grief, the way Garrick does. They hunt for profit, for the value of dragon scale and bone in the markets of the southern cities, and they are far more dangerous, far more organized than anything your village has ever managed to send against me. You think they've found us here?" "I think," Kalith said, rising to his feet with a tension that filled the entire chamber, "that we are about to find out." Illyra felt the fear settle deep into her chest, colder and sharper than anything she'd experienced during the village's exile, understanding with sudden, terrible clarity that whatever peace they'd managed to build together in this hidden valley over the past 2 weeks was about to be tested by a danger far greater than either of them had yet faced. The riders emerged from the tree line at the valley's southern edge just as the sun reached its highest point, and Illyra counted nearly 20 of them from her position, high on the cliff above Kalith's cave, each one armed with weapons far more sophisticated than the simple bows the village hunters carried. Heavy crossbows, some fitted with barbed chains rather than simple arrows, and long spears tipped with a dull, oily metal that Kalith had warned her, in a hurried whisper only minutes before, was treated with a poison strong enough to bring down even a fully grown dragon. At the front of the formation rode a man in dark, well-fitted armor, a heavy cloak marking him apart from the rest even at this distance, and something about the confident, unhurried way he surveyed the valley told Illyra immediately that this was Baron Corwin Vale himself, a man who had clearly done this many times before and expected, with unshakable certainty, to succeed again. "We need to move," Kalith said, already positioning himself to shield the cave entrance where Illyra crouched. "There's a passage through the northern cliffs, narrow enough that riders can't follow on horseback. If we can reach it before they close the distance, they'll see us the moment we break from cover, Illyra said, watching the formation spread wider across the valley floor, clearly preparing to encircle the cliff entirely rather than approach it directly. They already know exactly where your den is. This isn't a search, Calith. This is a trap they've been planning. Below, Baron Vale raised a hand, and the formation halted as one, the discipline of it sending a fresh chill through Illyra despite the distance separating her from the riders. When he spoke, his voice carried up the cliff face with a clarity that suggested either remarkable training or some manner of magical amplification, cold and level in a way that made the hair on Illyra's arms rise. "Calith of the Ashvale line," Vale called. "I know you're in that cave. I've tracked you for 3 years, ever since word reached the southern guilds of a dragon operating alone in these mountains, cut off from any pack that might otherwise defend you. You've made yourself an easy target, whether you realized it or not." Calith's jaw tightened, but he made no move to respond, remaining pressed low against the cave entrance, one wing curved protectively around Illyra despite her attempts to see past him toward the valley below. "I'll make this simple," Vale continued. "Come out peacefully, and I'll ensure your death is quick, painless, and your scales are taken with the respect owed to a creature of your rarity. Resist, and I promise you, the process will be considerably less merciful, both for you and for whoever else might be foolish enough to share that cave with you." Illyra's blood ran cold. "He knows I'm here." "He's guessing," Calith murmured, though the tension in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely certain of that himself. "But it doesn't matter. Whether he knows or not, he intends to kill me either way, and he won't hesitate to hurt you if it serves his purpose." Then we fight. 20 riders, armed with poisoned weapons, designed specifically to bring down dragons, against one wounded pair with nothing but a healer's satchel, and whatever strength I've recovered these past weeks. Calith shook his head grimly. "Those are not odds I'm willing to risk with your life hanging in the balance." "Then we run. You said there was a passage through the northern cliffs." "There is, but it will take time to reach, and the moment we break cover, every crossbow in that formation will be aimed at us within seconds." Below, Vale's patience appeared to be running thin. He gestured sharply, and a portion of the riders began moving toward the base of the cliff, dismounting with the efficient speed of men who had clearly practiced this exact maneuver many times before, scaling equipment already being unpacked from their saddles. "They're coming up," Illyra said, watching with rising dread as the climbers began their ascent. "We don't have time to wait for a better option." Calith made his decision in the space of a single breath. "Hold on to me, tightly, and don't let go no matter what happens in the next few minutes." Illyra scrambled onto his back without hesitation, gripping the base of his neck, the way she'd once seen village children imagine riding dragons in their games, though nothing about this moment carried anything resembling the innocent thrill of childhood fantasy. Calith launched from the cliff face with a powerful surge of his wings, and the valley dropped away beneath them with a suddenness that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. The crossbows fired almost immediately, a hail of poisoned bolts cutting through the air around them, and Illyra felt Calith bank sharply to the left, then right, weaving through the barrage with a desperate, instinctive skill that spoke to just how many times he must have practiced evading exactly this kind of danger during his years alone in these mountains. One bolt clipped the edge of his uninjured wing, and he let out a sharp hiss of pain but did not falter in his flight, climbing higher, faster, putting distance between them and the riders scrambling to remount their horses below. "Are you hurt?" Illyra called over the rushing wind, pressing her face closer to his neck as they climbed toward the northern peaks. "A graze. Nothing serious." His voice was tight with effort, muscles straining beneath her as he pushed for altitude and speed at once. "Hold on. We're not clear yet." Below, she could see Vale's formation regrouping, the mounted riders already spurring their horses into pursuit along the valley floor, following the natural pass that would eventually connect to the northern cliffs Calith had originally intended to reach on foot. It would take them considerably longer to circle around by land than it took Calith to simply fly the distance, but the gap was closing faster than Alira liked. The riders clearly familiar enough with the terrain to anticipate exactly where a fleeing dragon might attempt to disappear. "There," Calith said, banking toward a narrow gorge cut deep into the northern mountain face, barely wide enough for his wingspan to clear without scraping stone on either side. "If we can lose them in the gorge system, there are caves deep enough that even Vale's trackers won't easily follow." The flight through the gorge was the most harrowing few minutes of Alira's entire life. Stone walls rushing past close enough to touch on either side, Calith's wings beating in tight, controlled bursts to navigate the narrow twists and turns without losing momentum entirely. Behind them, she could hear the distant shouts of riders forced to abandon the gorge entrance entirely, their horses unable to follow where a dragon could fly. They emerged into a hidden cave system deep within the mountain, far from the valley they'd called home for the past 2 weeks. And Calith finally allowed himself to land, chest heaving with exhaustion, the graze along his wing bleeding freely enough that Alira immediately dismounted and began tending to it with the small selection of herbs she'd had the presence of mind to grab before their desperate escape. "We can't go back to the valley," Calith said, once his breathing had steadied enough to speak clearly. "Not while Vale and his men remain in these mountains. They'll be watching the cave, waiting for us to return." "Then what do? We survive. We find somewhere safer, further from any territory the Vale Order has already mapped, and we wait until either they lose interest or we find some way to end the threat they represent entirely." Alira pressed a fresh bandage against the wound on his wing, her hands steady despite the fear still thrumming through her from the chase, and found herself struck by the strange, quiet realization that even now, hunted and exiled and running for both their lives, she felt no regret whatsoever for the choices that had led her to this moment. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "Together. The way we always have." Calith turned his head to look at her, gold eyes soft despite the exhaustion and pain written across every line of his enormous frame, and for a moment, the danger surrounding them on all sides seemed to recede just slightly, replaced by something steadier, something that felt, against every reasonable expectation, remarkably like hope. "Together," he agreed quietly. "I don't think I could face any of this any other way now, even if I wanted to." Outside the cave, the sun continued its slow descent toward evening, and somewhere in the mountains behind them, Baron Vale's riders regrouped and began the careful, methodical process of narrowing their search, patient in the particular way of hunters who had never once failed to eventually claim their prize. They remained hidden in the deep cave system for 3 days, moving only when necessary, rationing the small supply of food Alira had managed to gather before their escape from the valley. Calith's wing healed slowly, the poison from the crossbow bolt requiring more of the Silvervein paste than Alira had on hand, forcing her to venture cautiously out each morning in search of fresh roots among the unfamiliar terrain surrounding their new hiding place. It was during one of these careful foraging trips that she encountered the old woman. She was crouched beside a narrow stream at the base of the mountain, filling a clay jug with water, and she looked up at Alira's approach, with none of the alarm Alira might have expected from someone living so deep in dragon territory. Her hair was silver white, her face deeply lined, and something in her steady, unhurried gaze suggested a life that had seen far stranger things than a young woman wandering alone through remote mountain paths. "You're not from around here," the old woman said, setting down her jug, "and you're moving like someone trying very hard not to be found." Alira hesitated, weighing the risk of honesty against the danger of a stranger who might, for all she knew, be connected to Vale's search parties in some way. But something about the woman's manner, calm and entirely unbothered by Alira's obvious wariness, encouraged a measure of trust she couldn't fully explain. "I'm looking for Silvervein root," she said carefully. "For a healing paste. A friend of mine was injured." The old woman studied her for a long moment, then smiled. an expression that transformed her weathered face into something warmer, more knowing. Silvervein grows thick along the northern bend of this stream, if you know where to look. But that's not the only wound you're carrying, is it, child? I can see it in the way you hold yourself. Something's chasing you. Someone, Illyra corrected quietly. A hunting party. Well armed, well organized. They're after my friend. The dragon, the old woman said, and it wasn't a question. Illyra's heart lurched with fresh alarm, but the old woman raised a weathered hand before she could speak, a gesture meant to calm rather than threaten. I've lived in these mountains longer than most remember, girl. I know a dragon's scorch marks when I see them on the cave walls 2 ridges over, and I know the sound of a hunting party moving with purpose when it passes close enough to hear. You needn't fear me. I have no love for men like Vale and the guilds he represents. You know of him? Everyone who's lived long enough in these mountains knows of the Vale Order, one way or another. They've hunted these ranges for gold and glory for longer than your grandmother's grandmother walked this earth. They killed my own husband, 30 years past, when he tried to stop them from slaughtering a nesting pair for their scales alone. The old woman's expression darkened with old grief, though her voice remained steady. I've spent every year since helping where I can, in whatever small ways an old woman living alone in the mountains is able to manage. Something in her words settled a measure of hope into Illyra's chest that she hadn't realized she'd been missing since their desperate flight from the valley. Will you help us? My friend needs somewhere safer to heal, somewhere Vale's men won't think to search. The old woman, who introduced herself as Marigold, agreed without hesitation and led Illyra to a hidden hollow behind a waterfall not far from her own small cottage, a space she claimed had sheltered wounded creatures of every kind over her many years in these mountains. It took considerable convincing, and no small measure of trust, for Caelith to allow himself to be moved from the deep cave system to this new, more exposed location. But Marigold's evident knowledge of dragon anatomy, of healing techniques even more refined than Illyra's own, quickly won his cautious confidence. You've done this before, Caelith observed, watching Marigold work with a practiced efficiency that spoke of decades of experience. More times than I care to count, Marigold said, mixing a fresh poultice with hands that showed no tremor despite her evident age. Your kind and mine share more history in these mountains than most remember. There was a time, generations back, when dragons and the mountain folk lived in something closer to partnership than fear. I've always believed that history could be reclaimed, given the right people willing to try. Under Marigold's care, and hidden safely behind the roaring curtain of the waterfall, Caelith's wing healed steadily over the following week, while Vale's search parties, according to Marigold's careful monitoring of the surrounding trails, gradually widened their search further and further from the hollow's actual location, frustrated by a trail that had gone cold the moment Caelith flew clear of the gorge. It was during this quieter, safer week that something between Illyra and Caelith finally settled into words neither of them had been ready to speak before. They sat together one evening at the mouth of the hollow, watching the last light of day filter through the waterfall's constant spray, painting everything in shades of gold and soft, shifting silver. Caelith's wing had healed enough that he could move without pain now, though Marigold had insisted on another few days of rest before attempting any real flight. I've been thinking, Illyra said quietly, about everything that's happened since that first morning in the ravine. How strange it is that finding you wounded changed the entire shape of my life so completely. Do you regret it? Caelith asked, and something vulnerable moved behind the question despite his careful tone. The exile, the danger, everything you've lost because of the choice you made that morning? Never. She said it without hesitation, with a certainty that seemed to settle something in him, some old fear finally allowed to rest. I lost a village that never fully accepted me in the first place. But I found something I never expected to find anywhere. Caelith, I found you. His gold eyes held hers in the fading light, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a rawness she'd rarely heard from him, even during his most honest confessions about his past. "I have spent 3 years believing myself unworthy of anything but solitude," he said, "that the grief I carried, the mistakes I made in the depths of that grief, meant I had forfeited any right to closeness with another living creature, human or otherwise. And then you knelt beside me in that ravine, and every certainty I'd built around my own unworthiness began to crumble, piece by piece, morning by morning, until I could no longer remember exactly why I'd believed it so completely in the first place. Kalith, I love you, Alira." The words emerged plainly, without embellishment, as though he'd been carrying them carefully for some time, waiting for the right moment to finally set them free. I don't know when it happened, or how something so vast could grow from something that began as simple gratitude for a stranger's kindness. But it's true, and I no longer wish to keep it hidden from you, regardless of how impossible our circumstances might seem. Alira felt something bloom warm and overwhelming in her chest, a feeling she'd been circling carefully for weeks, without allowing herself to name it fully, and now, finally spoken aloud between them, it settled into something solid and undeniable. "I love you too," she said softly. "I think I have for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. From the very first morning you trusted me enough to tell me your name." The space between them, always careful, always measured by an unspoken awareness of everything that separated their two worlds, finally closed entirely, and in the fading golden light behind Marigold's waterfall, surrounded by danger on every side and uncertain of what tomorrow might bring, they allowed themselves, for the first time, to simply exist together without fear, without hesitation, without anything held carefully back. Marigold, watching from a respectful distance near her cottage, smiled to herself, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had spent 30 years hoping to see exactly this kind of bond rebuilt between two worlds that history had spent generations trying to keep apart. "Rest well tonight," she called softly toward the hollow. "Tomorrow, we plan how to deal with Barren Vale once and for all. A love like that deserves more than a lifetime spent hiding in caves and waterfalls, however beautiful the view might be." The plan Marigold proposed the following morning was simple in concept, though considerably more dangerous in execution. Barren Vale, she explained, was a man who thrived on control, on the careful, methodical narrowing of his search until his prey had nowhere left to run. The only way to truly end the threat he posed, rather than simply outrunning him for another week before he inevitably picked up their trail again, was to turn his own confidence against him. "He believes he's hunting a wounded, isolated dragon with nothing but a frightened girl for company," Marigold said, spreading a rough map of the surrounding mountains across her cottage table. "He has no idea you've healed, no idea you have allies now, no idea this valley holds secrets even he hasn't uncovered in 3 years of searching." "What kind of secrets?" Alira asked. "There's a cavern system beneath the old falls, carved by water over centuries, narrow enough in places that a man on horseback couldn't hope to follow, but wide enough in others for a dragon to move through with room to maneuver. If we could lure Vale's men into that cavern, separate them from their horses and their easy retreat, Kalith would have every advantage his size and strength could offer." Kalith considered the proposal carefully, gold eyes narrowed in calculation. "It's dangerous. If his men have poison-tipped weapons ready in a confined space, the advantage could turn quickly against us." "Then we don't give them the chance to use them," Alira said, an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. "What if I'm the one who draws them into the cavern? Vale wants to catch us both. If he believes he's finally cornered the healer who's been protecting you, he won't hesitate to follow, and his focus will be split between capturing me and hunting you, which means his men won't be moving with the same discipline they showed at the valley." "Absolutely not." Kalith's response was immediate, sharp with a protectiveness that left no room for argument. "I won't use you as bait for a man who has already shown he's willing to hurt anyone who stands between him and his prize. Kalith, I won't be in real danger. I know these mountains now, thanks to Marigold, and I'll have a head start into the cavern system before any of his men get close enough to matter. You'll be waiting inside, ready the moment they follow." The argument continued for the better part of an hour, Kaleth's protectiveness warring against the plan's clear strategic advantage, until Marigold finally intervened with the calm, practical wisdom of someone who had navigated far more danger in her lifetime than either of them had yet faced. "Love isn't about wrapping someone in wool and refusing to let them near any danger at all," she said gently, resting a weathered hand on Kaleth's foreleg. "It's about trusting them to be capable, while standing ready to protect them with everything you have if the moment calls for it. Illyra has already proven, more than once, that she's far more capable than fear alone would suggest. Let her be capable now." Kaleth's resistance finally softened, though the worry never fully left his eyes as the three of them finalized the details of the plan over the following hours, mapping the cavern's twists and turns, identifying the narrowest passages where Vale's men would be forced to abandon their horses and enter on foot, exactly where Kaleth would need to position himself to hold the advantage. They set the plan into motion 2 mornings later, once Kaleth's wing had fully regained its strength. Illyra made herself deliberately visible near the eastern trail Vale's scouts had been patrolling for the past week, gathering herbs with an obvious carelessness that she hoped would read as the desperate carelessness of someone who had run out of safer options. It did not take long for a scout to spot her. Within the hour, she heard the distant sound of a horn, the signal Marigold had warned her Vale's men used to alert the rest of their formation, and shortly after, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats rising steadily louder as the main hunting party closed in from the west. Illyra ran, exactly as planned, her heart hammering with an adrenaline that made the fear feel almost distant, almost manageable, as she led the pursuing riders deeper into the mountain terrain toward the hidden entrance of the Falls Cavern. Behind her, she could hear Vale's voice calling orders to his men, sharp with the particular excitement of a hunter who believed his quarry had finally made a fatal mistake. She reached the cavern entrance with barely 100 yards of lead remaining, ducking through the narrow opening behind the roaring curtain of water, and continued deeper into the winding stone passages, following the path she and Marigold had mapped so carefully 2 days before. Behind her, she heard the first of Vale's men forced to dismount at the entrance, their horses unable to navigate the narrow opening, followed by the scrape of boots against stone as they pressed forward in pursuit on foot. The deeper chamber, when she finally reached it, opened into a wide, high-ceilinged cavern, lit by shafts of daylight filtering down through cracks in the stone above, and Kaleth was already waiting, pressed into the shadows along the far wall, gold eyes fixed on the passage entrance with a coiled, dangerous readiness she'd never seen in him before. Illyra crossed quickly to his side, and together they waited as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, echoing strangely off the cavern's high walls. Baron Vale emerged first, flanked by 8 of his men, the rest evidently having remained behind with the horses at the cavern entrance. His expression, upon spotting both Illyra and Kaleth together in the chamber's dim light, shifted from calculated confidence to something briefly, satisfyingly uncertain, before hardening once more into cold determination. "Clever," Vale said, raising a hand to halt his men's advance. "Using the girl as bait to draw us into a confined space where your size becomes an advantage rather than a liability. I underestimated you, Dragon. Few of your kind have shown that kind of strategic thinking in all my years of hunting them. You've hunted enough of us to know we're capable of far more than the stories your guild tells about us," Kaleth said, his voice carrying a deep, resonant warning that seemed to shake the very stone around them. "You should have taken that as a reason to leave these mountains, rather than as a challenge to overcome. My guild doesn't retreat from challenges. We profit from them." Vale's men had spread into a loose formation, crossbows raised, though the narrow confines of the cavern clearly made them uneasy in a way the open valley never had. "Surrender now, both of you, and I promise the girl at least will be released unharmed once we've claimed what we came for." "That isn't a choice either of us is willing to make," Illyra said, drawing herself up despite the fear thrumming through her chest. Vale's expression hardened further, and he gave a sharp gesture to his men. The crossbows fired almost simultaneously, but Calith was already moving, faster and more decisive than Alira had ever seen him, sweeping his tail in a wide arc that sent loose stone and dust billowing across the chamber, disrupting the archer's aim just enough that the bolts scattered wide across the cavern walls, rather than finding their intended marks. What followed was chaos, a blur of movement and shouted orders, as Vale's men scrambled to reload in the confined space, hampered by the narrow footing and the dust Calith's initial strike had thrown into the air. Elira pressed herself into a shallow alcove along the cavern wall, exactly as they'd planned, staying clear of the fighting while remaining close enough to reach Calith quickly if the tide of the confrontation turned against him. Calith moved through the chamber with a controlled, deliberate power, using his size and the narrow terrain to his advantage exactly as Marigold had predicted, forcing Vale's men back against the stone walls where their weapons became increasingly difficult to bring to bear. He was careful, Elira noticed, even amid the chaos, never striking with lethal intent, disarming and disabling rather than causing harm beyond what was strictly necessary to end the threat each man posed. Baron Vale, watching his carefully organized formation crumble into disarray, finally drew a weapon of his own, a long blade forged from the same dull, poisoned metal as his men's spear tips, and advanced directly toward Calith with a grim, focused determination that suggested he had personally ended more than a few dragons in his long career. Calith! Elira's warning tore from her throat before she could think better of exposing her position, and Calith turned just in time to avoid the blade's first strike, though the movement cost him his footing on the loose, water-worn stone. Vale pressed his advantage immediately, driving forward with a speed that belied his age, and for one terrible moment, Elira watched the poisoned blade arc toward Calith's exposed throat, with a trajectory that seemed impossible to avoid. Calith twisted at the last possible moment, a movement born of pure instinct rather than conscious thought, and the blade meant for his throat instead caught along the thick scales of his shoulder, drawing blood but missing the vital strike Vale had clearly intended. The force of the near miss sent Vale stumbling forward off balance, and Calith, recovering his footing with the same speed, brought his tail around in a controlled sweep that knocked the blade from Vale's grip entirely, sending it clattering across the stone floor well out of reach. Elira didn't hesitate. She darted from her alcove, scooping the fallen blade before any of Vale's scrambling men could reach it, and retreated quickly back toward the chamber wall, her heart pounding with the desperate clarity of someone who understood exactly how close that moment had come to ending in tragedy. With his weapon gone and his men in full disarray, several already fleeing back toward the cavern entrance rather than face a dragon fighting with such controlled, furious purpose, Baron Vale finally seemed to understand the position he'd found himself in. He backed toward the wall, hands raised, his earlier confidence entirely stripped away and replaced with the wary calculation of a man recognizing, perhaps for the first time in his long career, that he had genuinely misjudged an opponent. "Enough," Vale said, breathing hard. "Enough. I yield." Calith advanced slowly, deliberately, until his great head hovered mere feet above the Baron's own, gold eyes blazing with a controlled fury that made even Elira's breath catch. "You have hunted my kind for gold and glory across 3 generations," Calith said, voice low and resonant with barely restrained anger. "You killed this woman's neighbor's husband, 30 years past. You have shown neither of us a single moment of mercy since the day you arrived in these mountains. Give me one reason I should show you any different." Vale, pressed against the cold stone with nowhere left to retreat, said nothing, his earlier arrogance entirely gone, replaced by the plain, unvarnished fear of a man finally facing the true weight of the creature he'd spent his life hunting. "Calith," Elira's voice cut through the tense silence, steady despite everything they'd just survived. "Don't. Not because he deserves mercy, because you deserve to be more than what he expected you to become." Calith held his position a moment longer, the fury in his gold eyes warring visibly against the truth in her words, before finally, slowly, he stepped back, releasing Vale from the immediate threat of his presence. "Leave these mountains," Calith said, voice still hard as stone. "Take your remaining men and never return. If I see your face in these ranges again, the mercy I've shown you today will not be repeated." Vale did not need to be told twice. He scrambled toward the cavern entrance, gathering his scattered men along the way, several of them limping or nursing bruised limbs from the encounter, but none seriously harmed, and within minutes, the sound of retreating footsteps and, shortly after, distant hoofbeats fading into the mountain passes told Illyra and Calith that the immediate threat had finally, truly passed. Illyra crossed the chamber to examine the wound on Calith's shoulder, her hands already moving through the familiar, practiced motions of tending to him, though this time her fingers trembled slightly with the aftermath of fear finally allowed to surface. "That's twice now I've had to pull a blade's worth of trouble out of you," she said, trying to keep her voice light despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "I'm starting to think you attract danger the way flowers attract bees." "And I'm starting to think," Calith said, watching her work with an expression of profound tenderness, "that I would face every blade in Vale's entire guild 100 times over, if it meant I got to keep waking up beside someone willing to heal me each time." They made their way back to Marigold's cottage as the sun began its slow descent, and the old woman greeted them at her door with visible relief, having watched the retreating riders pass her own small clearing not an hour before. "It's done then," she said, ushering them both inside toward the warmth of her hearth. "Vale's guild will think twice before returning to these mountains, I suspect, once word spreads of how thoroughly their baron was outmatched." "For now," Calith said, settling carefully near the hearth while Illyra finished dressing his wound with fresh supplies from Marigold's well-stocked shelves. "Men like Vale rarely accept defeat gracefully, but we've bought ourselves time at least, and perhaps enough of a reputation that future guilds will think twice before hunting these particular mountains." That evening, once Marigold had retired to her own small room and the cottage had settled into the quiet stillness of night, Calith drew Illyra gently aside, out into the clear mountain air beneath a sky scattered thick with stars, more visible here than she'd ever seen them from the village below. "I've been thinking," he said, and something in his tone, careful and deliberate in a way that differed from his usual measured speech, made Illyra's pulse quicken with a nervous, hopeful anticipation, about everything that's happened since that first morning in the ravine, about how impossible it seemed then that a healer from a village that feared me could ever become the single most important presence in my life. And yet here we are. "Here we are," Illyra echoed softly. "You gave up your home for me. Your standing, your community, everything familiar and safe. You faced hunters and poison and a guild leader who would have killed us both without a second thought. And through every moment of it, you've stayed. Not because circumstance forced you to, but because you chose to, again and again." He lowered his great head until his gold eyes were level with hers, closer than she could ever recall him positioning himself before, and something in his expression carried a vulnerability that made her chest ache with tenderness. "I don't have a ring to offer you, in the way your village traditions might expect," he said, a faint, rueful warmth threading through the words. "I don't have gold, or land, or any of the things a proper suitor might present. What I have is this valley, this life, however uncertain it remains, and a heart that has belonged entirely to you since long before I found the courage to admit it aloud." Illyra's breath caught, understanding exactly what was coming even before he found the words to shape it, her own heart hammering with a joy so complete it nearly overwhelmed the lingering exhaustion of the day's danger entirely. "Illyra Hart," Calith said, voice steady, despite the emotion clearly moving beneath it. "Will you be my wife? Will you build this uncertain, unconventional life alongside me, for however many years the mountains and the stars above us are willing to grant?" For a moment, Illyra simply stood beneath the vast spread of stars. Looking up into the gold eyes of the creature, the entire world had once told her to fear, and felt nothing but a certainty so complete it left no room whatsoever for hesitation. "Yes," she said, and the word carried every ounce of joy she'd been carrying carefully in her chest since that very first morning weeks ago, when a wounded dragon had spoken her name for the first time with something like wonder. "Yes, Kalith. I will." His answering warmth, the way his entire posture seemed to loosen with relief and joy in equal measure, told her more clearly than any words could have that the fear of rejection had weighed on him far more heavily than he'd let show. He lowered his head further still, resting his forehead gently against hers in a gesture of such careful tenderness that Illyra felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes. "Then we begin building a life together," he murmured. "Whatever it costs, whatever challenges still wait for us ahead, I will meet every single one of them gladly, so long as I meet them beside you." Behind them, unseen in the darkness of her small cottage window, Marigold smiled to herself, having quietly witnessed the entire exchange, already turning her thoughts toward what celebration such a remarkable union might deserve, and toward whether, perhaps, there might yet be a way to help mend the deeper wound still waiting far below in the village Illyra had once called home. Word of what had happened in the mountains reached the village long before Illyra and Kalith ever intended it to. One of Vale's fleeing men, passing through the lower trading routes on his way back to the southern guild halls, had spoken carelessly in a tavern about the humiliating defeat his baron had suffered at the hands of a dragon and the healer who stood fearlessly by its side. The story spread quickly from there, growing and shifting with each retelling, until it eventually reached the ears of Ren, who wasted no time making the difficult climb into the mountains to find her exiled friend and confirm the truth for herself. She found Illyra and Kalith in the valley they'd finally returned to once Marigold assured them Vale's retreat appeared genuine, and the reunion, when it came, left both women in tears within moments of Ren cresting the final ridge. "You're alive," Ren said, pulling Illyra into a fierce embrace the moment she was close enough. "The stories said you fought off an entire guild of dragon hunters. I told everyone in the village it had to be exaggeration, and then I climbed all this way, half convinced I'd find nothing but bad news waiting for me." "It wasn't exaggeration," Illyra said, laughing despite the lingering ache of everything they'd survived. "Though it certainly felt closer to bad news than good, more than once." Ren's gaze shifted to Kalith, standing a respectful distance away, and though old fear flickered briefly behind her eyes, it gave way quickly to something closer to genuine curiosity, and then, remarkably, "So this is the dragon who turned my closest friend's entire life upside down," she said, studying him with an openness that made Kalith incline his head in something like a formal greeting. "I am sorry for the trouble my presence has caused her," Kalith said, "though I confess I am not sorry for the outcome it has led us both to." "He asked me to marry him," Illyra said, unable to keep the joy from her voice despite the strangeness of the announcement. "I said yes." Ren's eyes went wide, disbelief warring visibly with delight, before she finally laughed, a bright, surprised sound that echoed pleasantly across the valley. "Of course you did. Of course this is exactly where your impossible kindness would eventually lead you." The news Ren carried back to the village proved more complicated than either Illyra or Kalith had anticipated. Some, particularly those who had lost family or friends during Kalith's darkest year of grief-driven anger, remained skeptical, unwilling to fully release fear that had shaped their entire understanding of dragons for generations. But others, moved by the story of a healer's courage and a guild leader's humiliating defeat, began to question, quietly at first and then more openly, whether the village's long-held fear had ever told the whole truth. Garrick Thorne was among the last to soften, and it took the better part of a month. Along with a careful, difficult conversation Illyra insisted on having with him directly, before something like understanding finally settled between them. She climbed down from the mountains alone one gray morning, leaving Calith behind at Marigold's insistence that this particular conversation needed to happen without a dragon's looming presence to complicate it further, and found Garrick at the edge of the village, tending the small memorial stone his family had raised for his brother years before. "I heard what happened," Garrick said, without looking up from his work. "The guild leader, the fight in the caverns. Half the village is calling you a hero these days. Strange, considering they exiled you not 2 months past." "I'm not here for their opinion," Illyra said, settling onto the grass beside the memorial stone. "I'm here for yours." Garrick finally looked at her, old grief still evident behind his eyes, though something in his expression had shifted since the last time they'd stood face to face in that crowded meeting hall. "My brother is still dead, Illyra. Nothing that's happened in the mountains changes that. I know, I would never ask you to pretend otherwise, or to forgive something that isn't yours to forgive on his behalf." She paused, choosing her next words with the same careful honesty she'd learned from Calith over the past weeks. "But I wanted you to hear it from me directly. Calith carries what happened that day with him every single moment, the same way you do. He isn't the same creature who made that terrible choice in his grief. He spent every year since trying to become someone worthy of a second chance he never expected to receive." Garrick was quiet for a long while, his gaze drifting back toward his brother's memorial stone, weathered now by 3 years of mountain seasons. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he finally said. "Not fully, maybe not ever." "That's fair. I'm not asking you to. But I saw the tracks in that ravine weeks ago. I saw how badly wounded he was, and I chose to keep hunting him anyway, even wounded, even helpless." He shook his head slowly. "Maybe there's a difference between the creature I've spent 3 years hating and the one you've apparently spent 2 months coming to know. I don't have it in me to celebrate your marriage, Illyra, but I think, perhaps, I can find it in me to stop hunting him." It was not full reconciliation, not the warm acceptance Illyra might have hoped for in some better version of this difficult conversation, but it was something real, something honest, and she found herself grateful for even that small measure of peace between two griefs that had spent far too long defining themselves entirely through each other's pain. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the valley Calith had once called home alone and now shared fully with Illyra, beneath a sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch. Marigold officiated, drawing on old traditions from a time when dragons and mountain folk had lived in closer harmony, and Wren stood beside Illyra as the only guest from the village willing to make the long climb, though several others, Illyra later learned, had quietly wished her well from a distance. They weren't yet brave enough to close entirely. Illyra wore a simple dress of pale blue, gathered wildflowers woven through her hair by Marigold's careful hands, and when she finally stood facing Calith beneath the vast mountain sky, she felt none of the fear or uncertainty that might once have seemed reasonable for a match so entirely unprecedented. "I promise you my heart," Calith said, voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to soften even the ancient stone around them. "For as long as these mountains stand, and beyond, if such a thing is possible. I promise you my protection, my honesty, and every ounce of gratitude I carry for the healer who looked past every story the world had told about me and chose, instead, to see the truth." "I promise you my heart as well," Illyra said, her own voice steady, despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "I promise to keep choosing you, every single morning, the way I chose you that very first day in the ravine. Not because circumstance demands it, but because there is nowhere else in this world I would rather be." When Marigold finally pronounced them bound, the sound that rose from Calith's chest, low and resonant and unmistakably joyful, echoed across the entire valley, carrying, Illyra liked to imagine, all the way down to the village that had once feared him, and would, in time, come to understand the truth of everything she had known since that very first wounded morning. In the months that followed, the story of the healer who married the dragon everyone once feared began to spread beyond the mountains, carried by traders and travelers who passed through the region, transforming slowly from a cautionary tale about monsters into something far different, a story about the danger of believing the worst of anyone based on grief and fear alone, and the quiet, powerful courage it takes to look past both and choose compassion instead. Garak never fully made peace with Caliph, though he stopped hunting the mountains entirely, choosing instead to focus his energy on protecting the village from more ordinary dangers. And in time, even he found himself, on rare occasions, defending Alira's choice to those who still spoke of her with lingering suspicion. Ren visited often, climbing the mountain path that grew steadily more familiar with each passing season, and slowly, other villagers began to follow, cautious at first, curious about the valley where a dragon and a healer had built a life together, and then, gradually, less cautious, as Caliph proved himself, visit after visit, to be exactly the gentle, thoughtful presence Alira had always known him to be. The village that had once exiled her never fully became the home it had failed to be during her childhood, but something new grew in its place, a fragile, hopeful bridge between two worlds that had spent generations defined entirely by fear of one another. And at the center of that bridge stood Alira and Caliph, healer and dragon, wife and husband, proof that the most feared stories in the world sometimes only need someone brave enough to look past the fear and discover the truth waiting patiently underneath. Years later, when travelers passed through the region and asked about the strange, wonderful tale of the healer and the dragon, the villagers who remembered would tell it not as a story of monsters and heroes, but as a story of two wounded hearts who found, against every expectation the world had placed upon them, exactly the healing each had been searching for all along.